Before the markets open and before the factories begin to thicken the London sky with smoke, there are already figures moving along the exposed banks of the Thames. In the thin gray light of early morning, they appear only as silhouettes against the water, bent slightly forward as they walk, their boots sinking slowly into the heavy mud that the tide has left behind. The river has pulled away for a few quiet hours, revealing a long stretch of wet gravel, broken timber, and dark, sulfur-scented muck where the city has been quietly discarding its past for generations. Welcome to a quiet moment wrapped in candlelight history. I am Amadeo Francis Hawthorne, your humble guide and storyteller. Tonight we wander together into the forgotten corners of the past. But first, if you don't mind, whisper in the comments where you're listening from and at what hour your candle burns tonight. Introduction. The people who come here are called mudlarks, though the name carries a kind of lightness that their work rarely deserved. They are not explorers, and they are not treasure hunters. They are men, women, and sometimes children who have come to the riverbank because the river occasionally gives back small things that can be sold before the day is finished. A copper nail loosened from an old barge, a handful of clay pipe stems, a scrap of coal dropped from a passing vessel, or the rare coin that has slipped unnoticed from someone's pocket above the waterline. These are the quiet possibilities that draw them down into the mud while most of the city is still asleep. There is nothing graceful about the labor itself. The mud grips at the boots and resists every step, and the cold water that gathers in shallow channels numbs the fingers almost at once. The air carries the mingled smells of river rot, smoke, tar, and sewage drifting from the great city rising just beyond the embankments. Yet in the slow rhythm of searching, scraping, and turning the mud with patient hands, there exists a kind of stubborn dignity that belonged to many of the invisible workers who kept Victorian London alive. Tonight we walk slowly beside one of these figures at the edge of the Thames, following the muffled footsteps of a worker who survives not by what the city creates, but by what the river quietly returns when the tide retreats into the darkness. And as the fog drifts low across the water and the shoreline slowly reveals itself in the pale light of morning, we begin our descent toward the cold, exposed banks where the day's searching will begin. Tonight's reading is called The Muffled Footsteps of a Victorian Mudlark. Chapter 1. The Shoreline at Low Tide. When the tide retreats from the Thames, it does not reveal a shoreline in any pleasant sense of the word. What emerges instead is a wide, uneven stretch of blackened mud, wet gravel, broken pottery, and splintered timber, all left exposed for a few quiet hours before the river returns again. In the dim light of early morning, the ground appears almost metallic in places, glistening faintly beneath a pale London sky, while shallow pools of trapped water reflect the gray silhouettes of cranes, warehouses, and the distant outlines of bridges further upstream. The air here carries the unmistakable scent of a working river. There is the sourness of rotting wood from old pilings that have stood in the water for decades, the faint bitterness of coal smoke drifting from factory chimneys, and beneath it all the heavy, sulfurous odor of the mud itself, thick with the waste and debris of one of the busiest cities in the world. Victorian London depended upon the Thames for trade and transport, But the river was also the city's drain, its dumping ground, and its restless collector of everything that slipped, fell, or was cast away along its crowded banks. Along this exposed strip of riverbed, movement begins quietly as the first mudlarks arrive. They come down narrow paths and worn stairways that descend from the streets above, their figures appearing one by one through the thinning fog. Most carry little with them beyond a sack or small canvas bag, and perhaps a short stick or simple tool for turning the mud. Their clothing is heavy and worn from constant dampness, boots stiff with dried silt from countless mornings spent searching the river's edge. There is little conversation among them as they spread out across the shoreline. Each person moves slowly, scanning the ground with practiced eyes, watching for anything that breaks the dull texture of mud and gravel. Years of repetition have taught them that patience matters more than speed. The river does not surrender its small offerings easily, and most of what lies beneath the surface will remain hidden unless it is uncovered carefully, one handful of wet earth at a time. Now and then the silence is broken by the faint scrape of metal against stone or the soft splash of water as someone rinses a find in a shallow pool. A bent nail, a scrap of copper, a fragment of clay pipe. Objects that might seem worthless to the busy city above can still hold value here along the riverbank. Gathered in sufficient quantity, these small pieces of discarded life can be sold to scrap dealers, pipe collectors, or traders who make their living from the endless circulation of used materials through the city. For the mudlarks themselves, the work is rarely dramatic. It is slow, repetitive, and often cold enough to numb the hands long before the morning is finished. Yet it is also steady in its own quiet way, following the rhythm of the tides that rise and fall twice each day along the Thames. The river withdraws, the searching begins, and before long the water returns again to erase the footprints and cover the mud once more. And somewhere within this narrow window between the retreating tide and its inevitable return, the mudlarks continue their patient search through the river's dark and shifting memory. Chapter 2. The People of the Riverbank. At a distance, the figures moving along the Thames at low tide might appear solitary, each person bent quietly over their work, separated by several yards of wet mud and scattered debris. Yet the lives that brought them here share many common threads, woven together by hardship, scarcity, and the quiet persistence required to survive in one of the largest cities on earth. Victorian London offered opportunity to some, but for many others it offered only narrow margins between hunger and endurance. Along the riverbank, those margins became visible in the early light of morning. Mudlarks were rarely people who had chosen the work in any deliberate sense. More often they were individuals pushed gradually toward the river by circumstance. A dock laborer injured or unable to find steady employment might turn to the shoreline in search of scrap metal. An elderly worker whose strength had faded could no longer compete with younger men for factory wages. Widows with few options sometimes walked the embankments, hoping the river might yield enough small items to sell for a little bread or coal. In a city whose population had grown rapidly through the 19th century, there were always those who lived close to the edge of poverty, and the Thames offered one of the few places where survival required no employer and no formal permission. Among the most striking figures on the riverbank were the children. Contemporary observers who wrote about mudlarking in the Victorian period often described boys and girls working along the mud flats before sunrise, their small hands probing carefully through the wet gravel in search of pipe stems, bits of coal, or fragments of rope washed loose from passing barges. Some wore worn boots that leaked constantly in the cold water. Others worked barefoot, knowing that shoes would quickly be ruined by the mud and were too costly to replace. The river was not gentle work for adults, and for children it demanded an endurance far beyond what most modern observers would expect. Yet the riverbank also formed a kind of quiet community, even if conversation remained sparse during the hours of searching. Experienced mudlarks recognized one another by sight and understood the unspoken boundaries that separated one person's patch of shoreline from another's. Arriving early could mean the difference between finding something useful and discovering that the mud had already been turned by someone else's careful hands. In this way, the shoreline developed its own quiet order, guided less by rules than by the shared understanding that everyone present was trying to extract a living from the same uncertain ground. Victorian newspapers and social investigators occasionally wrote about mudlarks with a mixture of curiosity and unease. To many middle-class observers, the sight of people working directly in the polluted mud of the Thames seemed almost unimaginable, yet the practice was widely known and had existed along the river for generations. Some reformers worried about the health and safety of those who depended on such work, particularly the children who spent long hours in the cold water. Others simply regarded mudlarks as part of the city's vast and largely invisible laboring population, another example of how the poorest Londoners survived in whatever ways they could. For the mudlarks themselves, the river was neither symbol nor spectacle. It was simply a place where small fragments of value might be found if one searched long enough and carefully enough. A handful of pipe stems gathered during the morning might be sold later in the day. A few pieces of copper or iron might be added to a sack already heavy with damp metal. Each find was modest on its own, yet together they formed the fragile economy that allowed many of these workers to continue returning to the riverbank day after day. And so, as the light grows stronger over the Thames and the fog begins to thin across the water, the mudlarks continue their slow, patient movement along the exposed shoreline, each one guided by experience, necessity, and the quiet hope that the river may still be hiding something worth uncovering beneath the cold surface of its mud. Chapter 3: The Art of the Scrape. The work of mudlarking is not dramatic work, and to an outside observer it might even appear strangely uneventful. For long stretches of time, the mudlark simply moves a few careful steps across the exposed shoreline, pausing now and then to examine some small irregularity in the mud before bending down to investigate it more closely. The riverbank offers no clear map of where useful things might be found, and so the work becomes a slow conversation between the eye, the hands, and the shifting surface of the riverbed itself. Most mudlarks rely on little more than a short stick, a bent nail fixed into a wooden handle, or a small rusted trowel that has already seen many seasons of use. With these simple tools, they scrape gently through the upper layer of mud and gravel, turning the ground inch by inch in search of objects that may have settled there during the passing of the tide. The movement is deliberate and careful because the mud can easily conceal small pieces of metal or clay that disappear again if the surface is disturbed too quickly. Over time, experienced mudlarks learn to recognize certain sounds that signal the presence of something hidden beneath the wet gravel. A soft metallic scrape might indicate the edge of an iron nail buried just below the surface. A faint clicking sound can sometimes reveal a clay pipe stem striking against a stone as the mud is moved aside. These small noises, nearly lost beneath the quiet movement of water and wind along the river, become familiar markers for those who spend enough mornings listening carefully to the ground beneath their hands. When an object is uncovered, it is usually lifted slowly and rinsed in one of the shallow pools left behind by the retreating tide. Cold river water runs across the fingers as the mud is washed away, revealing the shape of whatever the Thames has surrendered on that particular morning. Sometimes it is nothing more than a bent scrap of metal or a broken fragment of pottery. At other times, it may be a small copper nail, a piece of chain, or the worn remains of a clay pipe that once passed through someone's hands many years before. These objects are not rare treasures, nor do they carry much individual value. Yet gathered together over the course of several hours, they begin to form a modest collection of materials that can later be sold or traded within the city's busy network of scrap dealers and merchants. In this way, the mudlark becomes part of a quiet economy that depends upon patience, persistence, and the constant movement of discarded goods through Victorian London. The work continues steadily as the morning progresses. Boots sink deeper into the soft ground, tools scrape slowly across wet gravel, and the canvas sacks carried by the mudlarks grow gradually heavier with the small fragments of the river's forgotten cargo. Above them, the city grows louder as carts begin to move along the streets and smoke rises from the factories. Yet along the riverbank, the searching remains patient and methodical, guided by the knowledge that the tide will eventually return to cover the mud once more. And so the mudlarks continue their quiet scraping along the shoreline, listening carefully to the subtle sounds beneath the surface of the riverbed, where the long memory of the Thames still hides the scattered remnants of London's daily life. Chapter 4: Treasures in the Muck. Most of what the mudlark uncovers along the Thames shoreline is unremarkable at first glance. The river is far more likely to return broken objects than complete ones, and many of the things that emerge from the mud have already spent years or even decades beneath the slow turning of the tide. Metal surfaces grow dull and dark beneath layers of silt. Pottery edges become worn smooth by the movement of gravel, and even coins sometimes appear almost anonymous after so much time hidden within the riverbed. Yet with patience, the careful searcher begins to notice that each object carries a small fragment of the city's story. A clay pipe stem may once have belonged to a dock worker pausing for a moment of rest beside a warehouse wall. A copper nail might have fallen from the hull of a cargo barge that carried timber or coal through the busy river traffic. A small brass button could have slipped unnoticed from a coat pocket as someone leaned over the railing of a bridge far above the water. In these quiet discoveries, the mudlark touches pieces of lives that have long since moved on. Sometimes the river reveals something slightly more surprising. A coin may appear beneath the mud, its surface darkened but still bearing the faint outline of a monarch whose reign has already passed into history. When rinsed carefully in the cold water of a nearby pool, the metal begins to reflect a dull glimmer beneath the gray morning light. Such finds are never frequent, yet they carry a small moment of satisfaction for the person who uncovers them, a reminder that the river still holds occasional traces of value beneath its shifting surface. The objects themselves are rarely dramatic, but their quiet variety reflects the immense activity that once surrounded the Thames. For centuries, the river served as London's primary artery of trade and movement. Barges loaded with goods passed constantly along the water, dock workers carried cargo along the wharves, and travelers crossed the bridges that spanned the river from bank to bank. In the midst of such activity, it was inevitable that small things would be dropped, lost, or swept away by accident, eventually settling into the mud below. For the mudlark, each discovery becomes part of a slowly growing collection gathered over the course of the morning. The items are placed quietly into a canvas sack, their surfaces still damp from the river. Individually, they may seem insignificant, yet together they represent the patient labor of several hours spent searching through the cold mud of the shoreline. By midday, the sack may hold enough pieces of metal, pipe fragments, or other scrap materials to be carried into the city and sold to a dealer who trades in such goods. There is no celebration when something useful is found, only a brief moment of recognition before the searching continues. The mudlark returns once again to the slow rhythm of walking, watching, scraping, and rinsing, guided by the knowledge that the river still hides countless other fragments beneath its surface. Somewhere beneath the wet gravel and dark silt lies the next small object waiting to be uncovered. And so the work continues quietly along the exposed bank of the Thames, where the scattered remains of London's daily life emerge slowly from the mud, one small discovery at a time. Chapter 5: The River and the City. As the morning progresses, the great city of London begins to stir more fully above the river. The pale light that first touched the rooftops spreads gradually across the warehouses, chimneys, and bridges that line the Thames, revealing the immense machinery of commerce that depends upon the water below. Smoke begins to rise from factory stacks, drifting slowly into the gray sky, while carts rattle along the streets carrying goods toward the docks where ships and barges wait to be loaded. The city, vast and restless, resumes its daily movement. Along the river itself, traffic slowly returns. Barges move carefully through the widening channel as the tide begins its long journey back toward the shore. Their dark wooden hulls cut quietly through the cold water, while dock workers call instructions to one another across the wharves. Chains clink, ropes tighten against the weight of cargo, and the steady rhythm of trade once again spreads along the length of the Thames. For generations, this river has served as London's lifeline, carrying timber, coal, grain, and countless other goods into the heart of the city. Yet below this rising activity, along the muddy strip of exposed shoreline, the mudlarks continue their work with the same patient rhythm that guided them before dawn. Their presence attracts little attention from the workers above the embankments. The distance between the bustling streets and the low riverbank is not great in physical terms, but in the quiet social landscape of Victorian London it can feel far wider. Those who labor in the mud beneath the bridges remain largely unseen by the thousands of people moving through the city above them. From time to time, the shadow of a passing barge drifts slowly across the shoreline as the vessel moves along the river channel. The water laps gently against the mud flats, sending small ripples through the shallow pools where mudlarks rinse their finds. Each ripple carries with it a subtle reminder that the tide is returning and that the hours of searching are slowly drawing to a close. The river that revealed this muddy landscape will soon claim it again beneath the rising water. Even so, the mudlarks continue their patient movements along the shoreline, scraping carefully through the gravel and mud for as long as the exposed ground remains available. The canvas sacks they carry grow steadily heavier with the small pieces of metal, clay, and scrap gathered during the morning. Each item represents another fragment of London's endless circulation of goods and materials, moving quietly through the hands of those who survive on what the city leaves behind. Above them, the city grows louder as the day advances. Factory whistles sound in the distance, horses pull wagons through the crowded streets, and the river traffic thickens as more vessels arrive along the docks. Yet along the shoreline, the work remains slow and deliberate, guided by the knowledge that soon the tide will erase every footprint and cover the mud once more beneath the steady flow of the Thames. For now, however, there is still time to search, and so the mudlarks remain at the water's edge, moving quietly through the fading hours of low tide while the vast city above continues its endless rhythm of labor and trade. Chapter 6: When the Tide Returns. Along the banks of the Thames, the first signs of the returning tide appear quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A narrow ribbon of water begins to creep slowly across the lowest stretch of mud, filling the shallow channels and small pools that had been left behind when the river withdrew. The movement is gradual and patient, yet unmistakable. What had been exposed ground only an hour earlier now begins to disappear beneath the steady advance of the water. For the mudlarks working along the shoreline, the rising tide is a familiar signal that the morning's labor is nearing its end. The exposed mud flats that offered a few hours of opportunity are steadily shrinking as the river reclaims its territory. Tools scrape once or twice more across the gravel as the last careful searches are made, though most who work here understand that the remaining time is short. The Thames does not wait for anyone who lingers too long along its banks. One by one, the mudlarks begin to gather the small items they have uncovered during the morning. Canvas sacks are lifted and tied shut, their contents shifting faintly as pieces of metal, clay, and scrap settle together inside. Boots pull heavily from the thick mud, leaving deep impressions along the shoreline that will soon vanish beneath the returning water. The work has been quiet and patient, and its ending comes in much the same way. Across the river, the movement of barges and small ships continues as the channel deepens once again. The water laps gently against the wooden pilings of the docks while ropes creak under the weight of cargo being loaded for the day's journeys. Above the embankments, the city has fully awakened now, yet along the river's edge, the final traces of the morning's searching are already beginning to disappear. Soon the muddy ground where the mudlarks walked will lie hidden once more beneath the shifting surface of the Thames. The footprints pressed into the wet soil, The shallow holes where tools scraped through gravel, and the small pools where objects were rinsed will all fade beneath the rising tide. By afternoon, there will be little sign that anyone had been there at all. And so the figures who worked quietly along the shoreline make their way back toward the narrow paths and worn stairways that lead upward into the streets of London. Behind them, the river continues its slow movement, covering the mud flats once again and carrying the city's restless waters toward the sea. Epilogue. For centuries, the Thames has gathered the scattered pieces of London's daily life, carrying them quietly beneath its dark and shifting waters. Objects lost in moments of carelessness or swept away by accident settle slowly into the mud, where they remain hidden until the tide withdraws and reveals them once again to patient hands. The mudlarks who walked these riverbanks belonged to a long line of quiet workers whose labor rarely appeared in the records of the city above them. Their days were shaped not by the clock towers or factory whistles of London, but by the steady rhythm of the tide itself. When the river retreated, they searched its muddy edges, and when the water returned, they stepped away and waited for the next turning of the current. Today, the shoreline has changed in many places, and the great city surrounding the Thames has grown far beyond the London those workers once knew. Yet the river continues its slow and ancient movement, rising and falling just as it did during the mornings when mudlarks walked the exposed banks searching for the small fragments of the city's past. And somewhere beneath the quiet surface of the water, hidden in the dark mud along the riverbed, countless forgotten objects still rest where the tide last left them, waiting patiently within the long memory of the Thames.